I arrived at my sister Jasmine's wedding, only to discover my name was missing from the guest list. Humiliated. I turned to leave until the restaurant manager rushed over, greeted me as ma'am, and suddenly everyone fell silent. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to treat you like a stepping stone. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old and currently the lead software developer and majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. To the business world, I am a highly respected tech entrepreneur and real estate investor. But to my biological family, I was always just the ugly, socially unfit college dropout who failed to meet their impossible standards. Growing up as a black woman in a wealthy suburb of Atlanta, my mother Vivian treated our family image like a religion. We had to look perfect, sound perfect, and associate only with the right people to maintain our status in the community. My older brother Jamal was the golden boy. He was a smooth talker who could do absolutely no wrong in my mother's eyes despite his constant reckless behavior. My younger sister Jasmine was the beauty queen groomed from birth to marry into old money and secure our family's position among the elite. I was the scapegoat. I preferred writing code in my bedroom to attending cotillions and country club dinners. I was quiet, analytical, and intensely focused on my own goals. When I was 18 years old, my mother secretly went to the bank and drained my entire college savings account. She took $80,000 of money I had saved from part-time jobs and academic grants, and she handed it all to Jamal to fund his doomed luxury car rental business. The business went bankrupt in 3 months. When I confronted them about the theft, my mother was furious that I dared to challenge her authority. She and Jamal packed my things in garbage bags and kicked me out of the house. They told me I lacked the hustle to survive in the real world, and that I was officially cut off for disrespecting the family hierarchy. I ended up sleeping in my beat-up sedan for 2 months while I worked 3 jobs to get back on my feet. 14 years passed since that day. I taught myself advanced coding, built my own agency from scratch, and made incredibly smart investments that turned my small tech startup into a multi-million-dollar empire. I never flaunted my wealth. I kept a low profile, drove a modest car, and let my family believe I was still struggling in a tiny apartment. Jasmine had finally managed to secure her ultimate prize by getting engaged to DeAndre. He was the only son of the Sterling family, a deeply respected and wildly wealthy real estate dynasty in Atlanta. The wedding was billed as the social event of the decade. The venue they chose was the Obsidian, a breathtaking luxury resort and event space in downtown Atlanta that was known for its exclusivity and strict vetting of guests. Despite our non-existent relationship, I received a formal invitation in the mail. I knew it was likely a ploy to show off Jasmine's success and rub my face in her extravagant new lifestyle, but I decided to attend anyway. I wanted to show them that I was doing perfectly fine and that their past cruelty had not destroyed me. I wore a stunning understated emerald green silk gown, got my hair professionally styled, and drove to the venue prepared to be perfectly civil, give my congratulations, and leave early. I walked through the towering glass doors of the Obsidian and approached the grand mahogany desk outside the main ballroom. The lobby was a masterpiece of modern architecture featuring cascading water walls and imported crystal chandeliers. A hostess in a crisp black uniform asked for my name. When I told her, she frowned and scrolled through her digital tablet. She checked again, her expression turning apologetic. "I am so sorry, ma'am," she said politely. "Your name is not on the cleared guest list for the Davis and Sterling wedding. I cannot permit you to enter the ballroom." Before I could even ask her to double-check the list or show her my physical invitation, the heavy ballroom doors swung open. Jasmine walked out looking like a magazine cover in a custom lace bridal gown that easily cost $30,000. She was flanked by Jamal, who wore a tailored velvet tuxedo, and my mother Vivian, who was dripping in expensive jewelry. DeAndre walked beside them looking handsome but slightly overwhelmed, accompanied by his perpetually scowling mother, Mrs. Sterling. Mrs. Sterling was a notorious snob in the Atlanta business community, famous for looking down on anyone she deemed beneath her tax bracket. Vivian saw me standing at the hostess desk and let out a loud, exaggerated sigh that echoed across the marble lobby. She marched right up to me, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the desk so DeAndre's mother could hear every single word. "I told you not to come, Nia," my mother hissed, her voice dripping with pure venom. "You simply do not fit in here. You are too loud, your lifestyle is an absolute embarrassment, and frankly, we cannot have a miserable college dropout ruining Jasmine's high society wedding. Mrs. Sterling is already highly skeptical of our background. I will not let your ghetto behavior and your pathetic presence jeopardize your sister's future with the Sterling family." Jasmine stepped forward, crossing her arms over her expensive gown. She looked me up and down with absolute disgust. "We talked about this," Nia Jasmine said smoothly, pitching her voice so the wealthy in-laws would hear her refined tone. "DeAndre's family represents pure elegance and old money. You showing up here reminds everyone of the time you were sleeping in your car like a vagrant. I sent you an email explicitly stating that your invitation was revoked and you were uninvited. We cannot risk you trying to network or beg for a job from our wealthy guests. It is just too humiliating for me on my special day." Jamal laughed loudly, adjusting his expensive diamond cufflinks. "Look at her, Ma," he sneered, shaking his head. "She probably spent her entire month of rent money just to rent that green dress to try and look like she belongs in our world. Just go back to whatever basement apartment you write your little computer codes in. You are completely socially unfit for this environment. You always have been." Vivian dug her manicured hand into her designer clutch and pulled out a crumpled $100 bill. She shoved it hard against my chest, letting the paper flutter down to the pristine marble floor. "Get an Uber," she commanded. "Go find a Waffle House and buy yourself a nice cheap dinner. Do not humiliate us by lingering in this beautiful lobby like a stray dog." The entire group stared at me with pure, unfiltered contempt. Mrs. Sterling shook her head in visible disgust, muttering something to DeAndre about unfortunate and low-class relatives. DeAndre looked away, too cowardly to intervene. I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the floor. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice, or show a fraction of the anger bubbling inside me. I simply looked at my mother, then at Jasmine, and gave them a slow, cold smile. "That is perfectly fine," I said smoothly, my voice carrying clearly through the quiet lobby. "I sincerely hope you enjoy the celebration you think you deserve today." I turned my back to them and began walking toward the main entrance, fully intending to leave them to their delusions. I had only taken 5 steps when the heavy sound of rapid, desperate footsteps echoed across the lobby. Antoine, the impeccably dressed general manager of the Obsidian, was practically sprinting across the marble floor. He shoved past a bewildered Jamal, nearly knocking my brother over, and stopped right in front of me. Antoine bowed deeply, his expression a mixture of profound respect and utter panic. "Ms. Davis," Antoine said, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. "Please forgive the front desk staff immediately. They are brand new hires and did not recognize your face. Shall I have the owner's luxury suite prepared for you immediately, or will you be dining at the chairman's exclusive table tonight? We have already decanted your favorite vintage wine." The absolute silence that fell over the lobby was intoxicating. You could hear a pin drop on the marble floor. Jasmine's jaw literally unhinged, her perfect makeup suddenly looking tight and pale as the blood drained from her face. DeAndre looked utterly confused, glancing between me and the manager. Mrs. Sterling's eyes darted wildly, her snobbish demeanor instantly shattering into total bewilderment. Vivian stumbled forward, her voice trembling and high-pitched. "Antoine, what on earth are you talking about?" she asked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Why are you bowing to her? She is just my failure of a daughter. She works in a basement." Antoine stood up straight. His polite, deferential demeanor vanished completely as he turned to face my mother. His eyes were pure ice. "Madam, I strongly advise you to watch your tone right this second," Antoine said sharply, his voice slicing through her arrogance like a blade. "You are currently standing in a property that is solely owned by Ms. Nia Davis. She is the founder and president of the investment group that purchased the Obsidian Resort last year for $30 million in cash. You are standing in her house, and if she gives the word, I will have security throw you out into the street." The shockwave of Antoine's words hit my family like a physical blow. Jamal took a step backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes, his arrogant smirk entirely wiped from his face. Jasmine gripped DeAndre's arm so tightly, her knuckles turned white, her eyes wide with a terror she could not hide. My mother Vivian stood frozen like a statue, her mouth opening and closing, as she struggled to comprehend that the daughter she had just handed a crumpled $100 bill to was the absolute owner of the most prestigious luxury resort in the entire state of Georgia. Mrs. Sterling, suddenly realizing she was in the presence of massive wealth, instantly adjusted her posture, her eyes recalculating my worth in real time. I turned around slowly, letting the silence stretch out, savoring every single second of their complete and utter devastation. The stage was set. The balance of power had completely shifted, and I was just getting started. The pristine marble floor of the lobby felt like a stage, and I was the director. Vivian was the first to break the heavy silence. I watched the gears turning in my mother's head as her initial shock instantly mutated into something far more insidious. Pure greedy opportunism. The woman who just shoved a crumpled $100 bill into my chest suddenly let out a loud, dramatic gasp. She lunged forward with her arms wide open and pulled me into a suffocating fake embrace that smelled of cheap desperation and expensive perfume. "My beautiful, brilliant girl," Vivian practically shouted. She pitched her voice so loud that it echoed off the crystal chandeliers, ensuring Mrs. Sterling and DeAndre caught every single syllable. "I always knew you were destined for absolute greatness. I was just testing your humility earlier. You know how much this family values staying grounded and remembering our roots. We are so incredibly blessed to have you back in our lives." I stood perfectly still. I did not return the hug. I let my arms hang at my sides until the sheer overwhelming awkwardness forced her to step back. Vivian did not miss a beat. She turned toward the wealthy in-laws with a blinding smile, displaying teeth that were entirely too white and too perfect for the ugly soul hiding underneath. "Did you hear that?" Mrs. Sterling Vivian clapped her hands together, acting as if she had just won the lottery. "My oldest daughter owns the Obsidian. The very ground we are standing on belongs to the Davis family. We are practically royalty in this city. Jasmine, look at your big sister. She bought this magnificent resort, just in time for your special day. What an amazing testament to the strong bond of Black family excellence." Jasmine recovered her composure with frightening speed. The absolute terror in her eyes vanished, completely replaced by the exact same calculating greed that infected our mother. Jasmine smoothed down her $30,000 custom lace gown and glided over to me. She linked her arm through mine as if we were the absolute best of friends, laughing softly to ease the tension in the room. "Nia, I am so incredibly proud of you," Jasmine purred. Her voice dripped with artificial sweetness that made my skin crawl. "This is the ultimate wedding present. To think you own this entire estate, and you kept it a secret just to surprise me on my wedding day. You really are the best sister in the world. So I assume we do not need to worry about the final invoice. Since you own the place, you can just comp the $150,000 balance for the ballroom and the catering right. Consider it your loving sisterly gift to the bride and groom as we start our new life together." The sheer audacity of her request hung in the air. She actually expected me to absorb a $150,000 tab after she just insulted my entire existence and tried to have me thrown out. Mrs. Sterling watched us closely, her eyes narrowing as she tried to calculate the new power dynamic. DeAndre looked incredibly relieved, clearly thinking his massive wedding bill had just miraculously vanished into thin air. I gently but firmly unlinked my arm from Jasmine's vice-like grip. I took 2 deliberate steps backward, creating a physical boundary between myself and their toxic entitlement. I looked my mother dead in the eye and let out a short, humorless laugh that echoed loudly in the quiet space. "Cancel the bill?" I asked smoothly. My voice was calm, but it carried a sharp edge that made Jamal physically flinch. I turned my attention to the general manager, who was still standing at attention nearby, watching the entire scene unfold with professional detachment. "Antoine, please bring the mobile payment terminal over here." Antoine nodded briskly. "Right away, Ms. Davis." He snapped his fingers, and a concierge immediately rushed over, holding a sleek silver point-of-sale machine. Antoine took the device and stepped forward, holding it out directly toward my mother. I looked back at Vivian and Jasmine. My expression was completely devoid of emotion. "We do not do handouts at the Obsidian," I said clearly, making sure my voice carried. The outstanding balance for the grand ballroom, the premium catering, the open bar, and the exotic floral arrangements is exactly $150,000. You signed the corporate contract, Vivian. Antoine will process your payment right now before a single appetizer is served to your guests. If the balance is not cleared immediately, the kitchen staff will be instructed to stop cooking and security will begin clearing the ballroom. Vivian's fake smile shattered into a million pieces. Her mouth dropped open in genuine horror. You cannot be serious, Nia. I am your mother. You are a multimillionaire. $150,000 is pocket change to you. You are going to ruin your own sister's wedding over a little bit of money. How can you be so incredibly heartless to your own flesh and blood? I am not ruining anything, I replied coldly. You booked a luxury venue. You received luxury service. Now you must pay the luxury price. That is how the real business world works. Did you honestly think you could spit on my shoes, hand me a crumpled bill to go eat at a diner, and then ask me for a massive six-figure financial favor 5 minutes later? That was the breaking point. The delicate facade of the happy, wealthy family completely collapsed. Jamal aggressively stepped forward, his face contorted with intense rage. He pointed a thick, heavy finger directly at my face, completely invading my personal space, as if trying to physically intimidate me into submission. "You listen to me, you arrogant little witch!" Jamal snarled. His voice echoed through the lobby, drawing the attention of arriving guests who paused in their tracks to watch the spectacle. "You owe this family. You owe us everything. You would not be standing here in that fancy dress if it were not for the sacrifices Mom made for us. You are going to zero out that invoice right now, or I swear to God, I will make you regret the day you ever showed your face back in Atlanta." The air in the lobby grew incredibly tense. Mrs. Sterling gasped loudly at Jamal's aggressive street behavior, clutching her diamond pearls in shock. DeAndre finally stepped forward, trying to pull Jamal back by his tuxedo jacket, but Jamal shoved him away violently, causing a scene that no high society family would ever tolerate. I did not back down. I did not flinch. I reached out and forcefully slapped Jamal's pointing finger away from my face. The sound of my hand striking his wrist echoed sharply in the quiet room, making several guests flinch. "I owe you," I asked, my voice dropping an octave. The cold fury I had buried for 14 years finally breached the surface. "I owe you, Jamal." "Do you mean the way I owe you for the $80,000 college fund Mom drained from my bank account when I was 18 years old? She stole every single cent I earned from working double shifts at the grocery store. She took my future and handed it to you so you could fund that pathetic luxury car rental business that crashed and burned in exactly 90 days. Jamal's face turned ashen. He glanced nervously at DeAndre and Mrs. Sterling, who were listening to every word with wide, shocked eyes. "Keep your voice down," Nia, Jamal muttered, trying to salvage his pride. "That is family business. We do not discuss that in public." "Oh, we are discussing it right now," I fired back, refusing to lower my volume. "You took my tuition money to lease sports cars you could not afford. And when I confronted you both about the theft, you and Vivian packed my belongings in black garbage bags and threw me out onto the street. You left me homeless. I slept in the back seat of my freezing sedan for 2 months. I showered at truck stops. I ate instant noodles while you were driving around Atlanta, pretending to be a self-made boss with my hard-earned money." Vivian stepped forward, looking absolutely panicked. She tried to grab my hands, but I stepped back again. "Nia, please stop talking. People are staring at us. We did what we had to do for the family. Jamal needed that investment. You were always smart enough to figure things out on your own. We knew you would be fine." "You did not know anything, Vivian," I said, my tone absolute ice. "You threw me away because I was no longer useful to your perfect image. You wanted a scapegoat and you found one in me. But I survived. I built an empire without a single dime or a single word of encouragement from any of you. And now, 14 years later, you have the absolute audacity to stand in my building wearing designer clothes and demand a free wedding." Jasmine began to cry actual tears this time. Her perfect day was unraveling in front of her wealthy future mother-in-law. "Nia, please, I am begging you. DeAndre's family is watching us. Do not embarrass me like this. Just comp the room. I will pay you back eventually, I swear it." I looked at my younger sister. She was a master manipulator just like our mother. No, Jasmine, I said firmly. The days of me paying for this family's mistakes are officially over. I turned my attention back to my mother and pointed at the silver payment terminal in Antoine's hands. Swipe the card, Vivian, I commanded. The deadline is right now. Pay the $150,000, or Antoine locks the ballroom doors and tells your 300 guests to go home. Vivian was sweating profusely. Her flawless makeup was beginning to run down her face. She looked at Jamal for help, but he was staring at the floor completely emasculated. She looked at Jasmine, who was quietly sobbing into her hands. Finally, she looked at Mrs. Sterling, who raised one perfectly arched eyebrow, silently judging the entire chaotic scene. The pressure was crushing her. Vivian knew that if she failed to pay, the wedding would be cancelled, and her reputation in Atlanta society would be permanently destroyed. With trembling hands, Vivian opened her designer clutch. She pulled out a heavy metal platinum credit card. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated hatred before slapping the card onto the payment terminal. There, Vivian spat out bitterly. Take your blood money. I hope you choke on it. I hope you remember this moment when you die alone in your empty mansion. I did not respond. I simply watched the terminal screen. Antoine processed the payment. The machine displayed a loading icon. The tension in the lobby was suffocating. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the receipt to print. Then the machine let out a loud, sharp beep. The screen flashed bright red. Antoine looked down at the terminal, then looked up at Vivian. His expression was completely blank, devoid of any sympathy. He cleared his throat and announced the result loudly enough for the entire wedding party to hear. Declined, Antoine stated flatly. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Declined, Vivian stammered. Her eyes bulged. No, that is impossible. Try it again. The machine must be broken. Run it again right now. Antoine tapped the screen and ran the platinum card a second time. Another loud, sharp beep echoed through the quiet lobby. The red screen flashed again. Declined, Antoine repeated. The card has insufficient funds and the bank has placed a hard freeze on the account. Jasmine let out a choked gasp and began to hyperventilate. She grabbed her chest, struggling to breathe as her perfectly orchestrated world began to collapse around her. Jamal backed away from Vivian, looking terrified. DeAndre stepped away from Jasmine, creating physical distance between himself and the impending disaster. I stood tall, watching the empire of lies they had built over 14 years finally crumble to dust right before my very eyes. This was just the beginning of the complete and total reckoning they so deeply deserved. The loud, sharp beep of the declined credit card was still echoing through the grand lobby of the Obsidian. Vivian stared at the mobile payment terminal as if it had physically bitten her. She kept pressing her manicured fingers against her temples, muttering frantically that there had to be a mistake with the bank. Jamal had retreated completely into the background, suddenly realizing that his loud, aggressive street behavior had absolutely no power against actual, tangible wealth. Jasmine was a total mess of tears and ruined makeup, clinging tightly to DeAndre's tailored tuxedo jacket, like a drowning woman holding onto a life raft. The balance of power had violently shifted and they were all drowning in the reality of their own public humiliation. But it was Mrs. Sterling who finally broke the pathetic tableau. She let out a sharp, aristocratic scoff that cut right through the heavy tension in the room. She stepped forward, her posture rigid with generations of supposed superiority. She smoothed down her custom-tailored skirt suit and looked at my mother with a mixture of intense pity and outright disgust. Mrs. Sterling was a woman who prided herself on being the pinnacle of Atlanta high society, and watching my family unravel was deeply offensive to her sensibilities. This is exactly what happens when you try to operate outside of your designated social tax bracket, Mrs. Sterling announced. Her voice was loud enough for the gathering crowd of wealthy wedding guests to hear. I told DeAndre from the very beginning that this union was a massive mistake. We are witnessing nothing but pure ghetto behavior, bouncing credit cards at a luxury resort, screaming matches in the lobby. It is completely classless and highly embarrassing to the Sterling family name. We do not behave like this. Vivian looked like she had just been slapped across the face. Oh, please, Mrs. Sterling, Vivian pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. It is just a temporary hold on the account. I can call my wealth manager right now and clear this up. Please do not let this ruin the beautiful bond between our families. We belong together. Mrs. Sterling ignored my mother entirely. She turned her arrogant gaze toward me. She looked me up and down, clearly trying to assert dominance over the situation. She opened her vintage Chanel handbag and pulled out a heavy matte black American Express Centurion card. She held it between two fingers, like a weapon ready to strike down the insolent upstart who was ruining her son's perfect day. "I will handle this unfortunate mess," Mrs. Sterling declared proudly, looking at Antoine. "My family has spent decades building a pristine reputation in the Atlanta real estate market. My firm brings in millions of dollars in revenue every single quarter. We do not bounce cards, and we certainly do not beg for charity from angry, estranged relatives. Process this payment immediately, Antoine. I am paying the $150,000 to save this wedding from becoming a laughingstock." Antoine looked at the black card, then looked at me, waiting for my instruction. He knew exactly who was in charge. I did not signal him to take it. Instead, I stepped closer to Mrs. Sterling. I let a slow, predatory calm wash over my features. The air between us grew freezing cold. I looked at the black card, then met her arrogant stare with absolute, unwavering confidence. I had been waiting for this exact moment since I read her corporate financial filings 3 months ago. "Are you absolutely sure you want to do that, Mrs. Sterling?" I asked softly. My voice was quiet, but laced with a lethal amount of authority. $150,000 is a significant amount of liquid capital. Considering your real estate firm barely avoided filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy last quarter, you might want to be a little more frugal with your personal spending. Mrs. Sterling's hand froze in midair. The arrogant sneer on her face vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. DeAndre took a sudden step forward, looking back and forth between his mother and me. He was completely unaware of his family's financial crisis. "What are you talking about?" DeAndre demanded. "Our company is perfectly fine. We are the Sterlings." Mrs. Sterling swallowed hard. Her voice lost all of its previous aristocratic confidence. It dropped to a nervous, trembling whisper. "How could you possibly know about that? Those financial struggles were strictly confidential. We kept the restructuring completely out of the press. No one outside of the executive board knows about our near bankruptcy. You have no right to speak on our private business matters." I smiled. It was the smile of a hunter who had just cornered her prey. I took my time delivering the next sequence of words, knowing they would completely shatter her reality and destroy her false sense of superiority. "I know about it because I read the quarterly reports, Mrs. Sterling," I replied smoothly. "You see, when a legacy real estate firm in Atlanta starts defaulting on their massive commercial loans, they go looking for private equity to bail them out quietly. Your board of directors reached out to a private equity firm called Apex Holdings. You begged them for an emergency cash injection to keep your doors open and prevent your creditors from seizing your assets and throwing you out onto the street." Mrs. Sterling's breathing became shallow. She clutched her Chanel bag tightly against her chest, treating it like a shield. "Apex Holdings is an anonymous angel investor group," she stammered. "We deal with their legal representatives. The chief executive officer's identity is strictly protected under non-disclosure agreements. You cannot possibly have access to those files. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings," I announced clearly. My voice echoed off the marble walls, sealing her fate. "I am the anonymous angel investor who authorized the $40 million buyout of your failing company. I own 40% of your family empire, Mrs. Sterling, which technically means I am your boss. You work for me. And I strongly advise you against putting a luxury wedding on your personal credit card when your company is currently undergoing aggressive debt restructuring under my direct supervision." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty crumbling to the ground. Mrs. Sterling physically staggered backward as if the marble floor had been pulled out from underneath her heels. The proud, haughty matriarch of the Sterling family was suddenly reduced to a trembling employee, standing in front of her absolute superior. She looked at the heavy black card in her hand, her face completely pale, and slowly, silently slipped it back into her purse. She did not say a single word. She simply lowered her head, utterly defeated and utterly humiliated. Vivian and Jamal were completely speechless. They had spent my entire life worshipping people like the Sterlings, treating them like untouchable royalty. They had told me I was not good enough to breathe the same air as this family. And now the woman they idolized was cowering in front of the daughter they had thrown away like trash. Jasmine let out a loud, miserable sob, burying her face in her hands. Her dream of marrying into an untouchable elite family had just been exposed as a complete and total fraud. Both families were broke, and I was the one holding all the keys to their survival. DeAndre, looking desperately embarrassed and trying desperately to be the man of the hour, stepped forward. His face was flushed with a mixture of intense shame and bubbling anger. He could not stand watching his mother be humiliated in front of the entire lobby, and he certainly could not stand the thought of his wedding being cancelled because neither family could afford the bill. He had to fix this to save his pride. He reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket and pulled out his latest smartphone. He pulled his shoulders back, puffing out his chest to project a false sense of authority and control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his grasp. "Nobody is canceling this wedding," DeAndre stated loudly, trying to reclaim some shred of masculine dignity. He tapped aggressively on his phone screen, opening up his banking application. "I am the Vice President of Operations at Sterling Real Estate. I manage my own highly successful portfolio. I will wire the $150,000 directly to the Obsidian from my corporate business account right now. We do not need your charity, Nia, and we certainly do not need your permission to get married today. Send me the routing details, Antoine. I am handling this immediately." Antoine pulled a sleek business card from his breast pocket with the resort's wire transfer details and held it out. DeAndre snatched it from his hand, his thumbs flying across his phone screen as he navigated his banking app to initiate the massive transfer. He glared at me, his eyes full of defiance, trying to prove that he was still a wealthy, capable groom who could rescue his beautiful bride from disaster. Jasmine looked up, a glimmer of hope returning to her tear-stained face. She reached out and touched DeAndre's arm, looking at him like a hero coming to her rescue. Vivian let out a massive sigh of relief, clearly thinking the financial crisis had been miraculously averted. Jamal crossed his arms again, trying to regain his arrogant posture, believing that DeAndre's wealth would finally put me back in my designated place as the family loser. I watched DeAndre type in the wire transfer details. I watched him enter the amount of $150,000. I watched him move his thumb toward the final confirmation button that would authorize the massive transaction and clear the debt. I did not stop him. I did not signal Antoine to back away. I simply tilted my head slightly to the side, studying DeAndre with a look of profound, chilling amusement. I offered a single quiet piece of advice that froze his thumb completely in midair. "You might want to check your available balances before you hit send, DeAndre." I let the warning hang heavily in the air. The absolute certainty in my voice made him hesitate. He looked up at me, his brow furrowed in confusion and growing panic. "What are you talking about?" DeAndre demanded, his voice defensive. "My corporate account has well over $300,000 in liquid cash. I checked it just last week when we paid the final vendor deposits. There is plenty of money to cover this wedding." I smiled a razor-thin smile. Yes, you had that money last week. But financial situations can change very rapidly when you share your passwords and accounting access with a woman who is desperately trying to maintain an illusion of wealth. I suggest you look at your current balance right now. Do not just look at the home screen. Look at your recent outgoing wire transfers. Look at where your money has actually gone over the past 48 hours. DeAndre's face twisted with uncertainty. He slowly pulled his phone back toward his chest. He tapped the screen to refresh his banking dashboard. He clicked into the detailed transaction history of his primary corporate account. He stared at the glowing screen for 1 second, then 2 seconds, then 3. His breathing suddenly stopped. The phone began to visibly shake in his hands. His eyes widened to the size of saucers, darting frantically across the screen as he scrolled down, trying to process the horrifying numbers staring back at him. The defiant, heroic groom who had just promised to save the day was suddenly replaced by a man looking at absolute, undeniable financial ruin. He slowly raised his head and looked directly at Jasmine. The look of pure, unadulterated horror on his face told the entire lobby everything they needed to know. The money was gone, every single cent of it. And the real nightmare for my toxic family had only just begun. DeAndre stood paralyzed in the center of the lavish lobby. His thumb hovered over his phone screen, refusing to move. The confident posture he desperately tried to project evaporated. He rapidly tapped the refresh icon, praying that the horrifying numbers staring back at him were just a technical glitch. The screen reloaded. The balance remained identical. His corporate operating account, which was supposed to hold well over $300,000 in liquid capital, showed a catastrophic negative balance. He clicked into the transaction history, his eyes darting frantically across the screen as he scrolled through pages of authorized wire transfers he had absolutely no memory of making. The silence in the room was absolute. Hundreds of elegantly dressed wedding guests stood completely still, watching the young heir to the Sterling real estate dynasty slowly fall apart. DeAndre looked up from his phone, his breathing ragged and uneven. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with my younger sister. Jasmine was already trembling. She clasped her hands together in front of her custom bridal gown, trying to maintain her innocent, helpless facade, but the sheer panic radiating from her body language told a completely different story. Jasmine, DeAndre whispered. His voice was so strained it barely sounded human. It cracked under the weight of his terrifying discovery. Where is the money? Where is the $300,000 from my corporate account? Jasmine took a hesitant step backward. She forced a highly exaggerated look of confusion onto her perfectly contoured face. "What are you talking about, baby?" she asked, her voice trembling with artificial innocence. "I do not know anything about your business accounts. We just checked those balances last week. There must be some kind of massive bank error. The system is probably down. Let me call the senior wealth manager right now and sort this mess out." She desperately batted her eyelashes, hoping her usual manipulation tactics would work. She even managed to squeeze out a single, calculated tear. She reached out to touch his arm, attempting to use her physical charm to soothe his panic. DeAndre violently snatched his arm away, stepping out of her reach as if her touch would burn him. "Do not lie to me," DeAndre shouted, his sudden volume making several guests jump in shock. He shoved the phone screen directly into her face. "This is not a bank error, Jasmine. These are direct authorized wire transfers. Dozens of them. They have been happening every single week for the last 8 months. The money was routed to offshore accounts and private limited liability companies that I have never heard of in my entire life. You are the only other person on this earth who has the security tokens and accounting passwords to access this specific corporate account. What did you do?" Jasmine burst into theatrical sobs. It was an Oscar-worthy performance of pure victimhood. She covered her face with her hands, wailing loudly so the entire lobby could hear her distress. "It was identity theft," she cried out desperately. "Someone must have hacked into our home network. Someone stole my security tokens. You know I would never touch your company money, DeAndre. I love you. We are supposed to be getting married today. Why are you attacking me on our wedding day?" Vivian immediately leaped into action to protect her golden child. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms protectively around Jasmine, glaring at DeAndre with ferocious indignation. "How dare you accuse my daughter of theft?" Vivian shrieked. Her voice echoed harshly off the marble columns. "She is a woman of high class and elegance. She does not need to steal from you. Your company was probably compromised by hackers. And instead of protecting your beautiful bride, you are standing here humiliating her in front of all our friends and family. You should be ashamed of yourself, DeAndre." Jamal stepped up right beside our mother, puffing out his chest to look intimidating. "Yeah, man, back off," my sister Jamal warned, trying to sound like a tough protector. "You better get your bank on the phone and figure out who hacked you before you start pointing fingers at our family. We do not tolerate disrespect." I stood a few feet away, watching the chaotic, pathetic spectacle unfold. I let them put on their show. I let Jasmine cry her fake tears. I let Vivian play the role of the outraged protective mother. I let Jamal pretend to be a tough guy. I waited until they had firmly painted themselves into a corner of absolute denial. Then I decided it was time to drop the hammer. "It was not a hacker, DeAndre," I stated clearly and loudly. Every eye in the lobby snapped back to me. Vivian glared at me with pure, unadulterated venom. Jasmine stopped sobbing for a fraction of a second, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes before burying her face back in her mother's shoulder. "Keep your mouth shut," Nia Vivian snarled. "You have caused enough damage today with your arrogant resort ownership stunt. Do not try to insert yourself into Jasmine's relationship. You know absolutely nothing about their finances." I ignored my mother. I looked at the general manager standing quietly by my side. "Antoine," I said smoothly, "please activate the digital presentation boards in the main hall. Let us give our lovely wedding guests a little transparency." "Right away, Ms. Davis," Antoine replied briskly. He pulled a sleek, high-tech tablet from his jacket pocket. He tapped the screen 3 times. Instantly, the massive LED screens lining the walls of the grand lobby flared to life. These screens were typically used to display beautiful floral patterns or corporate branding during our luxury events. Today they were going to display the absolute destruction of Jasmine's carefully orchestrated lies. Antoine wirelessly cast a highly detailed, neatly organized financial dossier directly onto the massive screens. The high-definition displays illuminated the entire room with stark, undeniable facts. Gasps of shock rippled through the crowd of 300 wealthy guests as they looked up and started reading the documents. Mrs. Sterling, who had been standing in stunned silence since her own humiliating exposure, stepped closer to the screens. She pulled a pair of designer reading glasses from her purse and squinted at the massive projections. Her face shifted from pale shock to a deep, dangerous shade of crimson. "What is this?" DeAndre asked, his voice shaking as he looked up at the towering displays. "This is the exact paper trail of your missing $300,000, I explained calmly, gesturing toward the screens. "My security and financial auditing teams at Apex Holdings are exceptionally thorough. When we acquire a controlling stake in a struggling company like the Sterling real estate firm, we conduct a forensic audit of all connected financial accounts to ensure our investment is fully protected. During our standard audit of your corporate's accounts last week, our software flagged dozens of highly suspicious outgoing wire transfers." I took a slow step toward Jasmine. She was shaking so violently, I thought she might actually collapse onto the marble floor. Vivian tried to pull her away, but Jasmine was paralyzed by fear. "You see, DeAndre," I continued, my voice carrying a ruthless clinical edge. Jasmine did not just want to marry into old money. She desperately needed to look like she already belonged there. She needed to prove to Atlanta high society that she was a wealthy, influential socialite. But living that kind of luxury lifestyle requires massive amounts of capital. Capital that our family simply did not possess. I pointed to the first set of highlighted transactions on the massive screen. These wire transfers, $45,000 over the past 8 months, were sent directly to an offshore public relations firm. A firm that specializes in purchasing fake social media followers, manufacturing artificial engagement, and planting paid promotional articles in digital lifestyle magazines. Your bride used your corporate funds to buy her entire online identity. She literally purchased her influencer status using your company payroll. DeAndre stared at the screen, looking sick. The crowd began to murmur loudly, exchanging shocked whispers and judging glances. I pointed to the next section of the financial dossier. "And these payments, amounting to over $80,000, were routed to a series of high-end luxury boutiques in Paris and Milan. They were for custom designer handbags, limited edition shoes, and the expensive jewelry she flaunts at every single country club dinner. She built her entire physical wardrobe using the money you were supposed to use to pay your commercial real estate contractors." Lies, Vivian shrieked at the top of her lungs, pointing a trembling finger at the screens. "These are fabricated documents. You paid someone to make these up just to frame your sister. You have always been insanely jealous of Jasmine's beauty and her ability to attract a high-value man. You are a bitter, lonely woman trying to destroy true love because you could never find it yourself." Jasmine suddenly broke away from our mother. She lunged forward, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure desperation and rage. She pointed at me, screaming hysterically. "She forged them, DeAndre. I swear to God she forged them. She is a computer programmer. She knows how to hack systems and create fake files. She is trying to ruin my life because she is miserable and utterly alone. Do not believe her. Please, baby, you have to believe me." She is just a jealous, spiteful loser. I stood perfectly still, letting their pathetic screams echo through the grand lobby. I did not raise my voice to argue. I did not try to defend myself against their wild accusations. I simply let them dig their hole deeper, ensuring that every single wealthy guest in the room witnessed their true toxic nature. I waited until Jasmine finally ran out of breath and stopped screaming. The silence returned heavy and expectant. I looked at my mother, then at my sister, and finally at DeAndre. I offered them a chilling, predatory smile that made the hairs on the back of Jamal's neck stand up. I slowly reached out and pointed toward the massive LED screens. "Keep reading, Vivian," I said softly, my voice dripping with absolute lethal intent. "Look at page 2 of the financial dossier. Your precious perfect daughter did not just steal from DeAndre." I gave Antoine a nod. He tapped his glowing tablet screen. The massive LED displays lining the lobby instantly shifted from DeAndre's depleted accounts. The bright white background of a formal legal document illuminated the room. The 300 wealthy guests stood in dead silence. They were captivated by the unfolding spectacle, watching the destruction of our family like a cinematic thriller. No one dared to whisper. The new document projected across the walls was not a bank statement. It was a notarized property deed, accompanied by a commercial loan agreement. I watched my father's eyes widen as he recognized the address printed in bold ink at the top of the page. It was the deed to my parents' sprawling suburban estate. "You see, DeAndre," I continued, my voice echoing across the silent lobby, "your vanishing corporate funds were only the second act of Jasmine's financial magic show. The first act began 5 months ago. That was when her credit card defaults caught up with her around the same time Jamal managed to rack up a catastrophic amount of underground gambling debts. They were broke and terrified of losing their high society status." I walked slowly toward the towering digital screens, gesturing toward the bottom of the projected loan agreement. "So the Golden Children decided to team up and commit real estate fraud," I announced. "They conspired to take out a second mortgage on our parents' home. They extracted $400,000 in cash equity to secretly cover Jasmine's defaulted credit lines and pay off the loan sharks hunting Jamal down. Since neither of them had the credit score or collateral to secure a loan on their own, they had to improvise. Look closely at the final page of the document. Look at the signatures." The screens zoomed in on the signature lines. Two distinct signatures were clearly visible at the bottom of the page: Vivian Davis and Darren Davis. Vivian let out a strangled gasp. She stumbled forward, staring at her own signature projected on the wall. "That is impossible," Vivian stammered, her voice shaking violently. "We never signed any loan agreements. We completely paid off the mortgage on that house 10 years ago. The house is totally free and clear." "It was free and clear," I corrected her coldly, "until your perfect daughter and brilliant son forged your signatures on a secondary mortgage application. They stole your identities, Vivian. They used the family home as collateral to bail themselves out of the financial holes they dug with their own arrogance and greed." Jamal looked like a cornered animal. He wiped sweat from his forehead, looking wildly around the room for an escape route. "I did not forge anything," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Jasmine knew a guy at the title company. She set the whole thing up. I took my half of the cash to handle my business. She is the one who signed the fake papers." Jasmine whipped her head around and glared at Jamal with murderous intent. "You absolute coward!" Jasmine shrieked at the top of her lungs. "You begged me to do it. You said the bookies were going to break your legs if you did not pay them back by Friday. You promised you would flip the money and pay the mortgage back before Mom and Dad found out." The lobby erupted into a chorus of shocked gasps. The wealthy guests could no longer contain their absolute horror. They were watching a supposedly elite family tear each other to shreds over forged documents and illegal gambling debts. Mrs. Sterling covered her mouth with her hand, looking ill at the prospect that her son had almost married into a family of criminals. Then a voice broke through the utter chaos. It was a voice that had been entirely absent for the entire evening. "You mortgaged the house." My father, Darren, stepped forward from the back of our family group. He had been standing in silent complicity this entire time, enabling Vivian's cruel behavior and watching me be humiliated without saying a word in my defense. But now his face was the color of ash. His shoulders were slumped and his hands were trembling uncontrollably as he stared up at the massive screens. Darren walked slowly toward Jasmine and Jamal. His voice cracked with a mixture of heartbreak and overwhelming disbelief. "You mortgaged the house," he repeated, his tone dropping barely above a whisper. "The house my grandfather built with his own two hands. The house that survived the Depression. The only real asset this family actually owned. You forged my name and gave it to the bank." "Dad, please," Jasmine cried out, reaching for him. "I am so sorry. We were going to pay it back. I was going to use DeAndre's money to clear the debt after the wedding. I just needed a little bit of time. We did not mean to hurt you." Darren did not reach back. He looked at his two favorite children as if he was seeing them for the very first time. The perfect illusion he had spent decades protecting was completely shattered. He slowly turned away from them, burying his face in his hands, as a quiet, devastating sob escaped his chest. He was a broken man, crushed by the children he had elevated above me his entire life. But Vivian was incapable of accepting reality. Her mind simply refused to process the fact that her golden children were criminals who had stolen her home. Instead of holding them accountable, she instantly reverted to her deepest, most toxic defense mechanism: denial and pure emotional manipulation. Vivian rushed forward and threw her arms around Jasmine, pulling the weeping bride into a fierce, protective hug. She shot a sharp warning glare at Darren, silently demanding that he suppress his raw emotions for the sake of their public image. "Stop crying!" Darren Vivian snapped harshly. "We are not doing this right now. We are a strong family, and family always sticks together through hard times. We will figure this out." Jasmine and Jamal made a silly mistake. They were under pressure to maintain our standard of living. "It is just money. We can fix this problem today." Vivian turned her desperate, crazed eyes toward me. The woman who had literally shoved a crumpled $100 bill into my chest less than an hour ago was now looking at me like I was her personal savior. The sheer blazing hypocrisy of her sudden shift in demeanor was absolutely nauseating to witness. "Nia," Vivian said, her voice dripping with a sickeningly sweet, pleading tone. "You see the terrible situation your siblings are in. You own this entire resort. You are the head of a massive investment firm. You have hundreds of millions of dollars at your immediate disposal. You can fix this entire misunderstanding right now." I stared at her, my expression completely blank. I did not move a single muscle. "I need you to write a check," Vivian demanded, her tone shifting from a plea to an entitled expectation. "I need you to write a check to the bank and pay off this ridiculous mortgage immediately. You have to save the family name, Nia. We cannot let these high society people think we are criminals. We cannot lose the house your great-grandfather built. You have the power to make all of this go away. It is your duty to step up and protect this family." The audacity of her demand hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. After a lifetime of emotional abuse, after watching them drain my college fund, after being thrown out onto the freezing street, after being publicly degraded and uninvited from this very wedding, she expected me to open my checkbook and bail them out of a felony fraud charge. She expected me to purchase their salvation using the very wealth she had just viciously mocked me for lacking. I looked at Vivian. I looked at Jamal, who was staring at me with a pathetic glimmer of hope in his eyes. I looked at Jasmine, who was clinging to our mother's dress like a frightened child. I felt absolutely nothing for any of them. No anger, no sadness, no obligation. I looked at them with zero empathy. The emotional bond that tethered me to this family had been permanently severed 14 years ago when I was freezing in the back seat of my car. I slowly shook my head. My voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of mercy. "I am not saving anything, Vivian," I said smoothly. Vivian's fake smile collapsed. "What do you mean you are not saving anything? You have the money. You have to help us." "I do not have to do anything," I replied, taking a deliberate step closer so she could see the finality in my eyes. "I am not your personal bank. I am not your safety net. You made it abundantly clear that I do not belong in this family. You chose your perfect golden children. You enabled their greed. You funded their arrogance. Now you get to experience the direct consequences of your own terrible parenting." I tilted my head, offering her a final chilling piece of information that would seal their absolute doom. "And you might want to start packing your bags tonight, Vivian," I added softly. Because your golden children did not just forge your signatures, they stopped making the monthly interest payments on that fraudulent loan. You have missed 3 consecutive payments. The grace period expired yesterday. The bank forecloses on Monday morning. The magnitude of the betrayal registered in DeAndre's eyes. The illusion of his perfect bride dissolved, completely replaced by the horrifying reality of a calculated, desperate fraud. He stared down at Jasmine. She was clinging to our mother's dress, sobbing hysterically, and begging him to listen to her excuses. DeAndre was finished listening. He straightened his posture, pulling away from the toxic spectacle of my family. He turned to face the crowd of 300 elite guests who were watching the entire scene in absolute silence. DeAndre cleared his throat. His voice echoed through the grand lobby of the Obsidian, carrying a heavy final tone of absolute disgust. There will be no wedding today. The collective gasp from the audience was instantaneous. Jasmine let out a piercing wail, reaching out for him, but he stepped back again, refusing to let her touch him. DeAndre looked down at her with pure contempt. "You did not just lie to me," DeAndre said, his voice shaking with anger. "You systematically robbed my company to fund a fake lifestyle. You manipulated my family, you stole from my accounts, and you bankrupted your own parents just to pretend you belonged in my world. You treated our relationship like a corporate bank account that you could plunder at will to satisfy your shallow ego. Every single smile, every kiss, every vow you made to me was completely poisoned by your unbelievable greed. I am thoroughly disgusted by you and everyone in your family who enabled this pathetic fraud. I am canceling this wedding immediately. There is absolutely no future for us. Furthermore, my corporate attorneys will be contacting the authorities first thing on Monday morning. I am pressing full criminal charges against you for corporate embezzlement and wire fraud. You will pay back every single cent you stole from my business, even if it means you spend the next 10 years sitting in a federal prison cell, stripped of all your designer clothes." Mrs. Sterling stepped forward, her posture rigid. She linked her arm through her son's, shooting one final glare at my mother Vivian. "We are leaving," Mrs. Sterling declared. "I will not spend another second breathing the same air as these common criminals." She turned to her side of the guest list, the wealthy Atlanta elite, who were whispering frantically among themselves, their faces pale with shock at the scandal they had just witnessed. "To all of the Sterling family guests, please exit the building immediately. Do not speak to these people. Do not engage with their theatrics. We apologize for this horrific inconvenience, but we will not associate our prestigious legacy with undeniable fraud. Please proceed to the valet. We will host a private reception at our family estate for our true friends." With that final devastating pronouncement, DeAndre and Mrs. Sterling turned their backs on my family. They marched toward the grand glass doors of the lobby, leading a massive exodus of high society guests out into the night. Jasmine watched her groom walk out the door, taking her entire fake future with him. The reality of her situation shattered her mind. She let out a guttural, agonizing scream and collapsed completely onto the pristine marble floor. Her custom $30,000 lace bridal gown pooled around her like a deflated parachute, instantly absorbing the dirt from the floor. She thrashed against the cold stone, weeping uncontrollably, ruining her immaculate makeup and tearing desperately at her expensive silk veil until it ripped apart in her hands. She had gambled her entire life on a foundation of lies, desperately trying to fake her way to the top of Atlanta high society, and now she was left with absolutely nothing but severe criminal charges and a mountain of insurmountable debt. The remaining guests began to shuffle awkwardly toward the exits. No one wanted to be associated with a family that had just been publicly exposed for committing felony real estate fraud and corporate embezzlement. They whispered rapidly to one another, avoiding eye contact with my mother as they hurried out the doors. Within minutes, the massive lobby of the Obsidian was entirely empty, save for my immediate family, myself, and the resort security staff. My father, Darren, stood completely frozen, staring at his wife and his 2 golden children. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire to ashes. He did not say a single word to Vivian. He did not try to comfort Jasmine as she wailed on the floor. He simply turned around, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat, and slowly walked out the front doors, leaving them behind to face the consequences of their own actions. Vivian watched her husband walk away, her eyes wide with panic. The total abandonment by her spouse, her friends, and the high society elite she desperately worshipped finally pushed her over the edge into pure rage. She spun around to face me, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. Her eyes were wild, blazing with a fury that could no longer be contained by her usual passive-aggressive manipulation. Jamal, equally enraged and terrified of the violent loan sharks who would soon be knocking on his door without the wedding money to protect him, mirrored her explosive anger. They both looked at me, not as a family member, but as the enemy who had deliberately dismantled their entire fraudulent empire. "You evil witch!" Vivian screamed. Her voice echoed harshly in the empty marble space, raw and cracking with furious indignation. She took a threatening step toward me, her hands balled into tight fists, abandoning the refined persona she tried to project all night. "You planned this entire thing from the very beginning. You waited until the most important day of your sister's life just to destroy us when we were surrounded by all our peers. You could have told us in private. You could have come to us quietly and handled this behind closed doors like a real family protecting each other. But no, you wanted to ruin us in front of everyone who mattered. You did this to intentionally destroy your own flesh and blood because you could never get over the past." Jamal did not bother with words. He let out a furious roar and lunged directly at me, his heavy fists raised, fully intending to physically assault me right there in my own hotel lobby. He was completely out of his mind with desperation, looking to punish me for the catastrophic failure of his own gambling debts and criminal choices. I did not flinch. I did not step back. Before Jamal could take 2 full steps in my direction, 4 massive security guards in tailored black suits materialized from the shadows of the lobby. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. 2 guards tackled Jamal around the waist, slamming him onto the marble floor and pinning his arms behind his back. The heavy thud of his body hitting the stone echoed loudly. Jamal grunted in pain, struggling helplessly against the overwhelming physical force of my security team. The other 2 guards stepped directly in front of Vivian, creating an impenetrable human wall between her unhinged fury and my personal space. Vivian halted immediately, gasping in shock, as the reality of my power physically manifested in front of her. She stared at the guards, then looked at me, her chest heaving with exhausted breaths. I slowly walked around the security guards, my emerald green silk gown trailing elegantly across the floor. I stopped just inches away from my mother, looking down at her with absolute unwavering dominance. "You wanted a private conversation, Vivian," I asked, my voice deadly calm. "You are upset because I did not handle this quietly behind closed doors." I leaned in closer, making sure she could see the cold, unforgiving truth in my eyes. "You wanted a public spectacle when you handed me that crumpled $100 bill at the door," I whispered coldly. "You wanted an audience when you loudly announced that I was a miserable, socially unfit college dropout who did not belong in your elite world. You deliberately tried to humiliate me in front of the Sterling family to elevate your own pathetic status. I simply gave you a much better show." Vivian opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. She was entirely defeated, crushed under the absolute weight of her own blinding arrogance. I straightened my posture and turned my attention to Antoine, who was standing quietly nearby, observing the final execution of my orders. "Antoine," I said clearly, gesturing toward the pathetic remains of my biological family. "The wedding is officially cancelled. These people are no longer guests at the Obsidian. Have security escort them off my property immediately. If they resist, call the Atlanta police and have them arrested for trespassing." "Right away, Ms. Davis," Antoine replied smoothly. He signaled the security guards. The guards hoisted Jamal off the marble floor, gripping his arms tightly. They grabbed Vivian by the elbows and practically dragged her toward the heavy glass exit doors. Jasmine was hauled up from her spot on the floor, her ruined wedding dress, leaving a trail of smeared makeup and spilled tears across the polished stone. They hauled the 3 of them toward the exit, ignoring their desperate screams and frantic protests. Antoine opened the main doors. A heavy torrential Atlanta rainstorm had begun outside, pouring down onto the pristine driveway. The guards physically shoved Vivian, Jasmine, and Jamal out into the freezing downpour. As the heavy glass doors began to swing shut, Jamal dug his heels into the wet pavement. He turned back toward the lobby, his face soaking wet from the pouring rain, his eyes burning with a desperate, psychotic rage. "This is not over, Nia," Jamal screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice fighting against the loud, crashing sound of the thunder. "Do you hear me? I swear to God this is not over. I am going to ruin your life. I will tell the whole world what a monster you are. I am going to take everything from you." I stood safely inside the beautiful, warm, opulent lobby of my $30 million resort. I watched the heavy glass doors click firmly shut, perfectly sealing out the sound of his pathetic, empty, desperate threats. I took a long, deep breath, smoothing down the front of my silk dress, feeling absolutely invincible for the first time in my entire life. They were finally locked outside in the freezing cold rain, facing immediate foreclosure, total financial bankruptcy, and a long sentence in a federal prison. I, on the other hand, was finally standing exactly where I truly belonged. The loud, sharp beep of the declined credit card echoed through the grand lobby of the Obsidian, like a final, devastating judgment. Vivian stared down at the mobile payment terminal, as if the sleek silver device had just physically struck her. She frantically pressed her manicured fingers against her temples, her chest heaving as she rapidly muttered that there had to be some kind of massive mistake with her bank. Jamal had completely retreated into this background, his tough street persona instantly evaporating. He suddenly realized that his loud, aggressive behavior had absolutely no power or leverage against actual tangible wealth. Jasmine was a total chaotic mess of ruined makeup and cascading tears, clinging tightly to Trey's tailored tuxedo jacket, like a drowning woman desperately holding onto a life raft. The balance of power had violently shifted, and they were all drowning in the harsh reality of their own public humiliation. But it was Mrs. Sterling who finally broke the pathetic, suffocating silence of the room. She let out a sharp, aristocratic scoff that easily cut right through the heavy tension hanging in the air. She stepped forward, her posture rigid with generations of supposed superiority and old money pride. She smoothly brushed down the front of her custom-tailored designer skirt suit and looked at my mother with a toxic mixture of intense pity and outright disgust. Mrs. Sterling was a woman who deeply prided herself on being the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society, and watching my family rapidly unravel in front of her was deeply offensive to her delicate sensibilities. "This is exactly what happens when you try to operate far outside of your designated social tax bracket," Mrs. Sterling announced proudly. Her voice was deliberately loud enough for the gathering crowd of wealthy wedding guests to hear every single word. "I told Trey from the very beginning that this union was a massive mistake waiting to happen. We are witnessing nothing but pure ghetto behavior. Bouncing credit cards at a luxury resort. Screaming matches in a public lobby. It is completely classless and highly embarrassing to the Sterling family name. We simply do not behave like this." Vivian looked like she had just been forcefully slapped across the face. "Oh, please, Mrs. Sterling," Vivian pleaded, her voice cracking with intense, pathetic desperation. "It is just a temporary hold on the account. I can call my senior wealth manager right now and clear this up in 5 minutes. Please do not let this tiny misunderstanding ruin the beautiful bond between our families. We belong together." Mrs. Sterling ignored my mother entirely. She turned her arrogant, calculating gaze directly toward me. She looked me up and down, clearly trying to assert her dominance over the situation. She slowly opened her vintage Chanel handbag and pulled out a heavy, matte black American Express Centurion card. She held it between two fingers like a loaded weapon, ready to strike down the insolent upstart who was attempting to ruin her only son's perfect day. "I will handle this unfortunate mess," Mrs. Sterling declared loudly, looking directly at Malik instead of me. "My family has spent decades building a pristine, untouchable reputation in the Atlanta real estate market. My firm brings in millions of dollars in revenue every single quarter. We do not bounce cards, and we certainly do not beg for charity from angry, estranged relatives. Process this payment immediately, Malik. I am paying the $150,000 right now to save this wedding from becoming a local laughingstock." Malik looked at the heavy black card, then looked directly at me, silently waiting for my instruction. He knew exactly who was actually in charge. I did not signal him to take the card. Instead, I took a deliberate, measured step closer to Mrs. Sterling. I let a slow, predatory calm completely wash over my features. The air between us grew freezing cold. I looked at the black card in her hand, then met her arrogant stare with absolute unwavering confidence. I had been patiently waiting for this exact moment since I read her corporate financial filings 3 months ago. Are you absolutely sure you want to do that, Mrs. Sterling? I asked softly. My voice was quiet yet heavily laced with a lethal amount of authority. $150,000 is a highly significant amount of liquid capital. Considering your real estate firm barely avoided filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy last quarter, you might want to be a little more frugal with your personal spending today. Mrs. Sterling's hand froze completely in midair. The arrogant, condescending sneer on her face vanished in a fraction of a second, entirely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Trey took a sudden step forward, looking back and forth between his mother and me. He was completely unaware of his family's severe financial crisis. What are you talking about? Trey demanded aggressively. Our company is perfectly fine. We are the Sterlings. Mrs. Sterling swallowed hard, her throat visibly working. Her voice lost all of its previous aristocratic confidence. It dropped to a nervous, trembling whisper. How could you possibly know about that? Those financial struggles were strictly confidential. We kept the corporate restructuring completely out of the press. No one outside of the executive board knows about our near bankruptcy. You have absolutely no right to speak on our private business matters. I smiled. It was the smile of a patient hunter who had just successfully cornered her prey. I took my time delivering the next sequence of words, fully knowing they would completely shatter her reality and permanently destroy her false sense of superiority. I know about it because I regularly read the quarterly reports, Mrs. Sterling, I replied smoothly. You see, when a legacy real estate firm in Atlanta starts defaulting on their massive commercial loans, they go desperately looking for private equity to bail them out quietly. Your board of directors reached out to a private equity firm called Apex Holdings. You practically begged them for an emergency cash injection to keep your doors open and prevent your angry creditors from seizing your assets and throwing you out onto the street. Mrs. Sterling's breathing became incredibly shallow. She clutched her expensive Chanel bag tightly against her chest, treating it like a physical shield against the truth. Apex Holdings is an anonymous angel investor group, she stammered defensively. We deal exclusively with their legal representatives. The chief executive officer's identity is strictly protected under heavily enforced non-disclosure agreements. You cannot possibly have legal access to those highly classified files. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Holdings, I announced clearly. My voice echoed off the polished marble walls, effectively sealing her ultimate fate. I am the anonymous angel investor who authorized the $40 million buyout of your failing company. I personally own 40% of your entire family empire, Mrs. Sterling, which technically means I am your boss. You work for me, and I strongly advise you against putting a luxury wedding on your personal credit card when your company is currently undergoing aggressive debt restructuring under my direct daily supervision. The silence that rapidly followed was absolute. It was the devastating sound of a proud dynasty completely crumbling to the ground. Mrs. Sterling physically staggered backward, as if the solid marble floor had been violently pulled out from underneath her heels. The proud, haughty matriarch of the Sterling family was suddenly reduced to a trembling, humiliated employee standing in front of her absolute superior. She looked down at the heavy black card in her shaking hand, her face completely pale, and slowly, silently slipped it back into her designer purse. She did not say a single word. She simply lowered her head, utterly defeated and utterly humiliated. Vivian and Jamal were completely speechless. They had spent my entire life blindly worshipping people exactly like the Sterlings, aggressively treating them like untouchable Southern royalty. They had constantly told me I was simply not good enough to even breathe the same air as this elite family. And now the wealthy woman they idolized so deeply was actively cowering in front of the daughter they had thrown away like common trash. Jasmine let out a loud, miserable sob, burying her face deeply in her hands. Her lifelong dream of marrying into an untouchable elite family had just been brutally exposed as a complete and total fraud. Both families were entirely broke, and I was the only one holding all the keys to their survival. Trey, looking desperately embarrassed and trying desperately to be the strong man of the hour, stepped forward. His handsome face was heavily flushed with a toxic mixture of intense shame and bubbling unchecked anger. He simply could not stand watching his own mother be publicly humiliated in front of the entire lobby, and he certainly could not stand the thought of his lavish wedding being cancelled because neither family could afford to pay the massive bill. He had to fix this right now to save his wounded pride. He quickly reached into his tailored tuxedo pocket and pulled out his latest smartphone. He pulled his shoulders back, puffing out his chest to project a false sense of strong authority and control over a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of his grasp. "Nobody is canceling this wedding today," Trey stated loudly, desperately trying to reclaim some shred of his masculine dignity. He tapped aggressively on his phone screen, hastily opening up his mobile banking application. "I am the Vice President of Operations at Sterling Real Estate. I manage my own highly successful portfolio. I will wire the $150,000 directly to the Obsidian from my corporate business account right now. We do not need your pathetic charity, Nia, and we certainly do not need your permission to get married today. Send me the routing details." "Malik, I am handling this immediately." Malik calmly pulled a sleek business card from his breast pocket, containing the resort's official wire transfer details, and politely held it out. Trey aggressively snatched it from his hand, his thumbs flying rapidly across his phone screen as he frantically navigated his banking app to initiate the massive financial transfer. He glared at me, his eyes full of fiery defiance, desperately trying to prove that he was still a wealthy, highly capable groom who could rescue his beautiful bride from total disaster. Jasmine quickly looked up, a tiny glimmer of desperate hope returning to her tear-stained face. She reached out and softly touched Trey's arm, looking at him exactly like a hero coming to her ultimate rescue. Vivian let out a massive sigh of profound relief, clearly thinking the terrible financial crisis had been miraculously averted. Jamal confidently crossed his arms again, trying to regain his arrogant posture, firmly believing that Trey's immense wealth would finally put me back in my designated place as the ultimate family loser. I quietly watched Trey hastily type in the wire transfer details. I watched him enter the precise amount of $150,000. I watched him move his thumb directly toward the final confirmation button that would officially authorize the massive transaction and clear the crushing debt. I did not move to stop him. I did not signal Malik to back away. I simply tilted my head slightly to the side, carefully studying Trey, with a look of profound, chilling amusement. I offered a single quiet piece of advice that froze his thumb completely in midair. "You might want to thoroughly check your available balances before you hit send, Trey." I let the dark warning hang heavily in the tense air. The absolute unshakable certainty in my voice made him hesitate. He looked up at me, his brow deeply furrowed in deep confusion and rapidly growing panic. "What are you talking about?" Trey demanded, his voice heavily defensive. "My corporate account has well over $300,000 in liquid cash. I personally checked it just last week when we paid the final vendor deposits. There is plenty of money to cover this wedding." I smiled a razor-thin smile. Yes, you had that money last week. But financial situations can change very rapidly when you share your passwords and accounting access with a woman who is desperately trying to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. I suggest you carefully look at your current balance right now. Do not just look at the home screen. Look at your recent outgoing wire transfers. Look at exactly where your money has actually gone over the past 48 hours. Trey's face twisted with deep uncertainty. He slowly pulled his phone back toward his chest. He tapped the screen to refresh his banking dashboard. He clicked into the detailed transaction history of his primary corporate account. He stared at the glowing screen for 1 second, then 2 seconds, then 3 seconds. His breathing suddenly stopped. The phone began to visibly shake in his hands. His eyes widened to the size of saucers, darting frantically across the screen as he scrolled down, desperately trying to process the horrifying numbers violently staring back at him. The defiant, heroic groom, who had just boldly promised to save the day, was suddenly replaced by a man looking at absolute, undeniable financial ruin. He slowly raised his head and looked directly at Jasmine. The look of pure, unadulterated horror on his handsome face told the entire lobby everything they needed to know. The money was gone. Every single cent of it was gone. And the real nightmare for my toxic family had only just truly begun. The glass boardroom of Apex Holdings felt like a fortress overlooking the glittering skyline of Atlanta. I sat at the head of the long walnut conference table reviewing the architectural blueprints for our upcoming expansion with my business partner Xavier. He was a brilliant, fiercely loyal black man who had stood by my side through every grueling hurdle of building our tech empire. The sleek, minimalist design of the office reflected our shared vision of absolute clarity, purpose, and uncompromised strength. Before we could finalize the logistics, the heavy double doors of the boardroom flew open with a violent crash. Security did not even have time to call up from the lobby. Vivian and Darren burst into the room panting and disheveled. They had bypassed the front desk security by staging a theatrical, high-pitched emergency weeping loudly about a medical crisis to manipulate the young receptionist into letting them pass the electronic turnstiles. Vivian threw her designer handbag onto my clean desk, her face twisted in absolute desperation. She did not waste a single second on pleasantries or apologies for her behavior at the wedding. Instead, she immediately launched into a frantic barrage of guilt tactics, weaponizing our culture and our shared history to break down my resolve. "You have made your point," Maya Vivian wailed, crossing her arms and marching right up to my chair. "The drama at the wedding is over. Now give us the money to save the family home." The church prayer circle is actively praying for us right now. You cannot sit here in this luxury penthouse and let your own flesh and blood be thrown out onto the street to become homeless. We are Black. We do not do this to each other. We protect our own. The weaponization of our culture, invoking the sacred community bond of "we don't do this to each other," was a calculated manipulation tactic designed to trap me in an unbreakable web of familial obligation. But it only poured gasoline on the fire of my righteous anger. I stood up slowly, planting both palms flat on the mahogany table. I leaned forward, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "You talk about flesh and blood, Vivian. You didn't care about my flesh and blood when I called you crying from a freezing bus stop at 19 years old." I snapped, every word cutting through the room like a razor. "I was begging you for $20 just to buy a hot meal because Jamal had stolen my entire tuition fund to finance his fake lifestyle. You didn't care about my flesh and blood then. Do you remember what you told me on that phone call? You told me that God gives the toughest battles to his strongest soldiers, and that I needed to figure out how to hustle on my own. Well, lace up your boots, Vivian. It looks like God gave you a battle." Darren stepped forward, attempting to salvage what little patriarchal authority he thought he still possessed over me. He puffed out his chest, trying to look imposing, though his eyes were hollow and desperate. "Show some respect to your mother," Maya Darren barked, his voice cracking with artificial sternness. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. Respect is not something you demand, Darren. It is something you earn, and you lost every single ounce of it decades ago," I retorted, not giving him an inch of ground. "You traded your integrity for your golden children, and now you have to live in the wreckage. I am not giving you a single dime." Vivian's face instantly contorted with pure, unadulterated malice. The mask of the pious, suffering mother slipped away entirely, revealing the vindictive predator underneath. Her eyes narrowed into slits as she leaned over my desk, hissing out a final desperate threat that crossed every legal and moral line. "If you refuse to pay off our mortgage, Jasmine's new lawyer is going to leak a packet of fabricated health inspection reports to the local press." Vivian spat venomously. "We will get this corporate office and your precious resort shut down permanently. You will lose everything you built." The glass boardroom of Apex Holdings felt like an impenetrable fortress overlooking the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta. I sat at the head of the long walnut conference table, meticulously reviewing the architectural blueprints for our upcoming corporate expansion with my business partner Xavier. He was a brilliant, fiercely loyal man who had stood by my side through every single grueling hurdle of building our tech and real estate empire from the ground up. The sleek, minimalist design of our corporate office directly reflected our shared professional vision of absolute clarity, relentless purpose, and uncompromised strength. We were in the middle of discussing the massive budget allocation for the new property acquisitions when the heavy double doors of the boardroom flew open with a sudden violent crash. My security team did not even have the necessary time to call up from the main lobby to warn us. Vivian and my father Darren burst into the room heavily panting and completely disheveled. I later discovered that they had aggressively bypassed the front desk security by staging a highly theatrical, high-pitched fake emergency. They had been weeping loudly about a severe medical crisis to directly manipulate the young receptionist into letting them pass the electronic security turnstiles. Vivian marched straight into the room and threw her heavy designer handbag onto my perfectly clean desk. Her face was twisted in a mask of absolute desperation and pure entitlement. She did not waste a single second on pleasantries or offer any genuine apologies for her abhorrent toxic behavior at the wedding. Instead, she immediately launched into a frantic, aggressive barrage of emotional guilt tactics, actively weaponizing our culture and our shared history to try and completely break down my resolve. "You have made your point," Nia Vivian wailed loudly, aggressively, crossing her arms and marching right up to my leather executive chair. "The drama at the wedding is completely over now. We suffered our public humiliation. Now you need to do the right thing and give us the money to save the family home from the bank. The church prayer circle is actively praying for us right now to find a miracle. You cannot just sit here in this luxury penthouse and let your own flesh and blood be thrown out onto the street to become homeless. We are Black. We do not do this to each other. We protect our own people when they fall on hard times." The weaponization of our culture, invoking the sacred community bond of protecting our own people, was a highly calculated manipulation tactic designed specifically to trap me in an unbreakable web of toxic familial obligation. Vivian knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted me to feel a profound sense of racial and familial guilt for allowing my parents to face the consequences of their own fraudulent choices. But her pathetic attempt to use our community values as a shield only poured fresh gasoline on the fire of my righteous anger. I stood up slowly from my chair, planting both of my palms flat on the polished mahogany table. I leaned forward, looking down at the woman who had birthed me, my voice dropping to a dangerous icy register that immediately silenced her frantic wailing. "You want to talk about flesh and blood?" Vivian, I asked quietly, every single word cutting through the quiet boardroom like a sharpened razor. "You did not care about my flesh and blood when I called you crying from a freezing bus stop at 19 years old. I was begging you for just $20 to buy a hot meal because Jamal had stolen my entire tuition fund to finance his fake luxurious lifestyle. You did not care about my flesh and blood then. Do you remember what you told me on that desperate phone call? You told me that God gives the toughest battles to his strongest soldiers, and that I needed to figure out how to hustle on my own. Well, lace up your boots, Vivian. It looks like God just gave you a massive battle." Darren stepped forward from the doorway, attempting to salvage what little patriarchal authority he thought he still possessed over me. He puffed out his chest, trying desperately to look imposing and authoritative, though his eyes were completely hollow and heavily lined with the deep stress of his impending financial ruin. "Show some respect to your mother!" Nia Darren barked, his voice cracking with artificial sternness. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. You owe us the basic decency of helping your family when we are facing total destruction." "Respect is not something you can demand," Darren, I retorted sharply, not giving him a single inch of ground. "It is something you earn, and you lost every single ounce of my respect decades ago." You sat back in total silence while Vivian verbally and emotionally abused me my entire life. You traded your integrity as a father to protect your golden children, and now you have to live in the terrible wreckage they created. I am not giving you a single dime to save a house that was stolen through felony fraud. Darren's shoulders instantly slumped. The fake bravado drained from his body as he realized that his parental guilt trip was absolutely useless against me. But Vivian was entirely different. Her face instantly contorted with pure, unadulterated malice. The pathetic mask of the pious suffering mother slipped away entirely fully, revealing the vindictive predator hiding underneath. Her eyes narrowed into tiny slits as she leaned aggressively over my desk. She hissed out a final desperate threat that crossed every single legal and moral line in existence. If you refuse to pay off our mortgage today, Jasmine's new lawyer is going to leak a packet of completely fabricated health inspection reports to the local Atlanta press. Vivian spat venomously, slamming her fist on the table. We will get this corporate office investigated, and we will get your precious luxury resort shut down permanently. We will completely destroy your brand. You will lose everything you built, Nia. You will be right back on the street where you belong. Xavier, who had been sitting quietly analyzing the entire interaction, let out a low, dark chuckle. He slowly closed his laptop and stood up to his full height. He looked at my parents with absolute disgust. You just walked into a corporate headquarters and openly confessed to a conspiracy to commit felony extortion and corporate sabotage, Xavier said smoothly. You people truly have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. Vivian ignored him, keeping her furious eyes locked firmly on mine. I am not playing games with you, Nia. Jasmine's lawyer is a bulldog. He knows exactly how to manipulate the media narrative. The Black community is already turning against you because of Jamal's livestream. If we drop these fake health violations to the blogs, your wealthy clients will cancel their reservations overnight. Your resort will hemorrhage millions of dollars in a matter of days. Paying off our $400,000 mortgage is the cheapest option you have right now. It is simply the cost of doing business. I stared at her, completely unfazed by her pathetic attempt at corporate blackmail. The sheer audacity to walk into my office and threaten my empire was almost comical. She honestly believed that her petty, low-level manipulation tactics could intimidate a woman who had spent the last 14 years swimming with actual corporate sharks. You are threatening to destroy my business with fake documents, I asked, keeping my tone deceptively calm. You think a few fabricated health reports will bring down Apex Holdings? It will cause enough public relations damage to force your hand, Vivian sneered confidently. People believe what they read online. Once the blogs pick up the story that your resort is infested and unsafe, the truth will not even matter. You will be ruined. So write the check right now, or I make the phone call to the lawyer. I slowly reached out and picked up my desk phone. I pressed a single button, instantly connecting to my head of corporate security. Marcus, I need a full security detail in the main boardroom immediately. We have 2 hostile trespassers who need to be forcefully escorted from the premises. Vivian's confident sneer faltered. She looked at Darren, panic beginning to creep back into her eyes. You think I am bluffing? Vivian shouted, her voice rising in pitch. I will do it, Nia. I will ruin you. I hung up the phone and crossed my arms, looking at her with absolute pity. You are not going to ruin anything, Vivian, I said coldly. You do not understand how the real world works. Jasmine's cheap ambulance-chasing lawyer is entirely out of his depth. If he releases a single fabricated document about my company to the press, my legal team will bury him in so many defamation and corporate espionage lawsuits that he will lose his license to practice law before the weekend is over. Darren grabbed Vivian's arm, finally realizing the immense danger they had just put themselves in. Vivian, stop, he pleaded nervously. This is extortion. We can go to jail for this. We are already facing foreclosure. We cannot face prison time too. Vivian ripped her arm away from him, completely consumed by her toxic rage. I do not care. She owes us. She has all this money and she is letting us suffer. It is not fair. Life is not fair, Vivian. I shot back, my voice vibrating with absolute finality. You made your choices. You chose to fund Jamal's gambling. You chose to fund Jasmine's fake influencer lifestyle. You chose to forge documents and steal from the bank. And now you are choosing to try and extort a billionaire inside a building filled with high-definition security cameras that just recorded your entire criminal threat. The heavy boardroom doors swung open again. 4 massive security guards stepped into the room, their expressions grim and strictly professional. They quickly surrounded Vivian and Darren, forming a solid physical wall between my parents and my desk. Ms. Davis, the lead guard, said respectfully. Shall we contact the local authorities to report the attempted extortion? Vivian gasped, her eyes darting between the large security guards and my cold, unyielding face. The reality of her massive mistake finally crashed down upon her. She had pushed her luck entirely too far. She was no longer dealing with a helpless teenager she could easily manipulate. She was dealing with an absolute corporate titan who had zero tolerance for her toxic games. No, I replied smoothly, keeping my eyes locked on my trembling mother. Do not call the police just yet. Escort them out of the building, and make sure they are permanently banned from entering any property owned by Apex Holdings. If they ever step foot on my property again, you have my full authorization to have them immediately arrested for trespassing and corporate harassment. The security guards moved forward aggressively, grabbing Vivian and Darren by their arms. Darren did not resist. He simply hung his head in total defeat, allowing the guards to drag him away. But Vivian fought back, thrashing wildly against the security personnel as they pulled her toward the heavy doors. "You will burn in hell for this!" Vivian screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with pure, unrestrained hatred. "You are a monster. You are dead to me. You hear me. You are absolutely dead to me." I stood perfectly still, watching them drag her out into the hallway. I did not blink. I did not show a single ounce of regret. As the heavy boardroom doors firmly clicked shut, cutting off her pathetic, desperate screaming, I turned back to Xavier. I calmly picked up my pen and looked back down at the architectural blueprints spread across the table. "As I was saying, Xavier," I stated clearly, picking up our conversation exactly where we had left off before the interruption. "We need to allocate an additional $5 million to the Southern Expansion Project. Please ensure the accounting department processes the wire transfer by the end of the day. We have real and serious work to do right now." 2 weeks passed since my parents were forcibly escorted out of my corporate headquarters by my security team. In the ruthless, high-stakes world of elite Atlanta society, a pristine reputation takes decades of careful manipulation to build, but it only takes a few seconds of undeniable truth to completely destroy. The devastating domino effect of their own criminal choices finally caught up with them, crashing down with merciless precision. Exactly as I had predicted and warned them, the bank officially foreclosed on their sprawling suburban estate that very Monday morning. The massive iron gates of the property were padlocked shut and brightly colored. Public eviction notices were plastered aggressively across the custom mahogany front doors. The luxurious, untouchable lifestyle they had desperately maintained through blatant fraud evaporated overnight. The repo men arrived early Tuesday morning with heavy tow trucks to seize Jamal's leased luxury sports cars and Vivian's beloved imported Mercedes, dragging away the physical symbols of their massive, overwhelming ego. But the sudden financial ruin was only the beginning of their absolute nightmare. Mrs. Sterling was a woman who demanded pure, unadulterated vengeance when her prestigious family name was threatened by anyone she deemed inferior. The Sterling real estate dynasty unleashed their entire army of ruthless corporate attorneys. They officially pressed felony charges against Jasmine for corporate embezzlement and malicious wire fraud. The federal authorities moved swiftly, immediately freezing every single one of Jasmine's bank accounts. They stripped her of her remaining assets, leaving her absolutely penniless and staring directly down the barrel of a lengthy prison sentence. The glittering fantasy world she had built by stealing from DeAndre was completely annihilated, replaced by the grim reality of criminal indictments and aggressive prosecutors preparing for a massive, highly publicized trial that would permanently destroy her remaining dignity. Stripped of their grand home, their luxury vehicles, and their stolen funds, my biological family was violently thrown out of the elite social circles they had blindly worshipped for decades. With absolutely no other viable options, zero credit and empty pockets, they were forced to pack whatever clothing they could carry in black plastic trash bags. They moved into a cramped, run-down motel on the extreme forgotten outskirts of Atlanta. The dingy, roach-infested room, with its peeling water, damaged wallpaper, and flickering neon sign outside the cracked window, was a brutal, jarring contrast to the crystal chandeliers and imported silk sheets they were accustomed to. They went from dining on expensive caviar at country clubs to surviving on cheap vending machine snacks in a matter of days. Their towering arrogance had been entirely stripped away, leaving behind nothing but the stark, terrifying truth of their own crushing poverty. The social fallout was even more devastating to them than their massive financial collapse. Jamal, who had built his entire identity around being a wealthy, untouchable street boss with endless resources, found himself entirely abandoned by his followers. The moment his cash flow dried up and the violent loan sharks started circling the cheap motel looking to collect his underground gambling debts, his so-called loyal friends completely vanished into thin air. He was left isolated, terrified, and constantly looking over his shoulder every time a car drove past their door. The tough guy persona. He used to regularly intimidate people, instantly shattered when he had absolutely no money to back it up. I was reduced to a paranoid, fearful shadow of his former self, jumping at every single shadow outside his dilapidated room. Vivian experienced a similar agonizing social death that cut her to her very core. She had spent decades fiercely weaponizing her high status at her megachurch, proudly sitting in the front pews, and eagerly judging anyone who fell short of her pristine, hypocritical standards. But the moment the scandalous news of the foreclosure and the explosive embezzlement charges leaked to the entire congregation, her loyal church friends instantly stopped taking her calls. She was unceremoniously removed from the elite prayer circle. The prominent pastor refused to offer her counseling, completely shutting his doors to her drama. The very community she had constantly used to loudly shame me and elevate herself now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. They aggressively treated her like an infectious disease. My family became officially untouchable outcasts, in the very city they had desperately tried to conquer, banished to the absolute fringes of society. I monitored their spectacular, rapid downfall from the pristine sanctuary of my minimalist penthouse. I received regular, highly detailed updates from my private security team, diligently tracking their every move as they sank deeper into overwhelming despair. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or sadness. I was simply watching the natural, inevitable consequences of their own toxic actions unfold in real time. They had dug their own deep graves with their unfettered greed, and now they were forced to lie in them while the entire city watched their miserable demise. The ultimate breaking point happened on a cold, rainy Thursday evening. I was sitting comfortably on my velvet sofa, carefully reviewing highly classified digital contracts on my tablet when my private secure phone began to ring. Only a handful of trusted people possessed this specific unlisted number. I glanced down at the glowing screen and saw Vivian's name flashing brightly. I let the phone ring 4 distinct times before I calmly reached out and pressed the green answer button. I did not say a single word. I simply held the phone to my ear, waiting in absolute silence for her to launch into another aggressive tirade, another desperate threat, or another demanding guilt trip, invoking the sacred name of family loyalty and unconditional maternal love. But the voice that came through the small speaker was completely unrecognizable to me. There was no trademark arrogance. There was no haughty, demanding entitlement. There were no manipulative threats or toxic religious guilt tactics designed to aggressively break me down. There was only the raw, agonizing sound of total crushing defeat. It was the sound of a woman who had finally hit absolute rock bottom and fully realized she had absolutely no one left to blame but herself. Nia Vivian sobbed heavily into the receiver. It was a genuine, desperate weeping that physically tore from the very bottom of her lungs. The proud, untouchable, vicious matriarch of the Davis family was entirely broken into jagged, irreparable pieces. She gasped loudly for air, actively struggling to form complete sentences through her heavy, flowing tears. "Please do not hang up on me," Vivian pleaded, her voice trembling violently. I remained completely silent, intentionally, letting her profound desperation fill the empty space between us. I wanted her to feel the immense, suffocating weight of the power dynamic that she had personally created. I wanted her to deeply understand that I held her entire future securely in the palm of my hand. "Nia, please," Vivian begged, her voice harshly cracking as she continued to weep uncontrollably. We have absolutely nothing left. We have not eaten a hot meal in 2 days. Jamal ran off yesterday morning. He took whatever loose cash we had left in my purse and completely abandoned us. We do not know where he went, or if those dangerous men caught him. Jasmine is facing serious jail time, and her public defender says she will not win the case against the Sterling lawyers. We are freezing in a filthy motel room and we are totally terrified. You won. You completely won, Nia. Please help us out right now. I listened to her sob pathetically into the receiver. I let the heavy silence stretch out for another long, agonizing minute, ensuring she felt the absolute undeniable reality of her complete surrender. I slowly stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows of my luxury penthouse. I looked out over the glittering Atlanta city skyline, watching the rain streak heavily across the thick glass, feeling a profound sense of absolute control and vindication. They had brutally tried to destroy me, and instead, they had spectacularly destroyed themselves. Their reign of terror was officially over forever. I took a deep cleansing breath, allowing the cool air of my pristine apartment to fill my lungs. The game was finally ending exactly on my terms, and I was going to make absolutely certain that they never forgot the permanent consequences of their cruelty. I looked down at the dark city streets far below me, knowing my absolute victory was finally complete. "I will be at your motel in exactly 1 hour," I stated calmly, my voice entirely devoid of any warmth, pity, or mercy. "I am bringing a check. But it comes with a strict, legally binding contract. And you will sign it." The rain had finally stopped by the time my chauffeur pulled the sleek black Maybach into the crumbling, pothole-filled parking lot of the Starlight Motel. The heavy luxury tires crunched loudly over broken glass, discarded liquor bottles, and decaying garbage scattered across the asphalt. It was a filthy, forgotten stretch of highway on the extreme outskirts of Atlanta. The flashing neon sign above the main office buzzed violently, missing half of its letters. I stepped out of the luxury vehicle wearing a pristine, custom-tailored white wool suit. The stark contrast between my immaculate appearance and the absolute squalor of their new reality was entirely intentional. I wanted them to see exactly what they had thrown away. I wanted them to look at the walking, breathing manifestation of the power they could no longer control. My head of security. David walked a few paces ahead of me. He approached room number 112. The paint on the wooden door was peeling off in large, sickly green flakes. David knocked twice. Heavy, muffled shuffling sounded from inside. The door slowly creaked open. Darren stood in the doorway. He looked like a hollowed-out shell of a human being. His designer clothes were completely gone, replaced by a stained gray tracksuit. He stared at my pristine white suit, then looked past me at the Maybach idling in the lot. He stepped aside without uttering a single word, allowing me to enter the cramped space. The smell of the room hit me instantly. It was a suffocating mixture of stale cigarette smoke, damp mildew, and cheap fast food. Vivian was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress. Jasmine was curled up in the corner chair, her eyes red and swollen. Jamal was nowhere to be found, having cowardly fled the sinking ship, just as they had mentioned on the phone. They all stared at me in stunned, miserable silence. I did not take off my coat. I did not sit down on the stained floral bedspread. I walked directly over to the cheap laminate table sitting under the flickering overhead light. I opened my designer briefcase and pulled out a crisp, heavy piece of paper. I placed it face up on the sticky laminate surface. It was a certified cashier's check made out to Darren Davis. The amount was clearly printed in bold black ink. $150,000. Vivian's hollow eyes locked onto the piece of paper. She let out a ragged, desperate gasp and instinctively lunged forward to grab it. I slammed my hand down flat over the check, stopping her dead in her tracks. My eyes dared her to take another step. "You do not touch this until I say you can touch it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Look at the number, Vivian. It is exactly $150,000. It is not $1 million. It is not enough to buy back your sprawling suburban estate. It is not enough to replace your repossessed luxury vehicles or buy your way back into the country club. This money serves a very specific, strictly calculated purpose." I looked over at Jasmine, who was shivering pitifully in the corner. That check will cover the exact amount of legal restitution Jasmine owes to Trey and the Sterling family, keeping her out of a federal prison cell where she truly belongs. It will cover a basic security deposit and exactly 6 months of rent for a highly modest 2-bedroom apartment in a working-class neighborhood. You will be forced to clip coupons and work minimum wage jobs just to keep the lights on. It will keep you out of the homeless shelters and ensure you do not starve to death on the street. It is a survival fund. Nothing more. It is the absolute bare minimum required to keep you breathing. Vivian stared at my hand covering the check, her hands trembling violently. Thank you, Vivian wept, her pride entirely broken. Thank you, Nia. We will pay you back. We promise. I slowly lifted my hand off the check. I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents. I slid the contract across the cheap table, placing it right next to the money. I am not just giving you this cash, I stated coldly. You are going to earn every single penny of it. You are going to perform for it. Vivian looked at the thick contract, confusion wiping away her tears. What do you mean perform? She asked nervously. What does that document say? Jamal thought he was incredibly clever when he went on Instagram Live 2 weeks ago, I explained. He used that platform to paint me as the evil, bitter villain to our entire community. He cried fake tears and told all your church friends and our extended family that I framed an innocent bride and maliciously destroyed this family out of pure jealousy. He controlled the narrative. Now, you are going to use that exact same platform to tell the absolute truth. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the legal contract. This document contains a legally binding, meticulously written script. In exactly 30 minutes, the three of you are going to log on to Jamal's public social media account using the only cheap smartphone you have left. You are going to start a live broadcast. You will wait patiently until your prominent church members, your gossiping country club friends, our extended relatives, and every single person who watched you humiliate me at that wedding logs on to watch. And then you are going to read this script aloud, word for agonizing word. You are going to publicly confess to draining my $80,000 college fund when I was 18 and leaving me homeless. You are going to confess to the secondary mortgage fraud and the corporate embezzlement. You are going to confess to the decades of relentless psychological gaslighting. I turned my icy gaze directly toward Jasmine. And finally, Jasmine is going to confess to her attempted bribery. She is going to look into the camera and admit that she tried to pay a catering staff member to slip a severe allergen into my food the night before the wedding, actively attempting to hospitalize me. The tiny, damp motel room became deathly quiet. The only sound was the violent buzzing of the broken neon sign outside the window. Jasmine buried her face in her hands, letting out a sharp, terrified wail. Darren stood completely frozen, staring at the thick legal script as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at his chest. Vivian physically recoiled from the table as if the paper was actively burning her. The deep ingrained obsession with her public image, her desperate need for high status, and her pristine standing in the Black church community violently flared up, temporarily overriding her crushing immediate poverty. You cannot possibly be serious, Vivian breathed, her voice rising in sheer, unadulterated panic. You want us to go on the internet and confess to felonies. You want us to humiliate ourselves in front of the entire congregation, in front of the pastor, in front of everyone we know in Atlanta. If we say these things out loud, we will be complete outcasts. We will never be able to show our faces in our community ever again. People will look at us like we are monsters. Yes, I replied smoothly, completely devoid of any human empathy or lingering daughterly affection. They will finally look at you exactly the way you aggressively forced them to look at me my entire life. They will see you for the absolute monsters you truly are. You actively wanted to permanently destroy my hard-earned corporate reputation just to save your own pathetic skin. Now the scales are being permanently balanced. Vivian shook her head frantically, her pride fighting a losing battle against her desperation. No, Vivian cried out, stepping away from the table. We cannot do this, Nia, please. Just give us the loan. Do not make us destroy our dignity. I will do anything else. I did not argue with her pathetic pleading. I did not raise my voice in anger. I simply reached out firmly, picked up the certified cashier's check for $150,000, and smoothly slipped it right back into my leather designer briefcase. I snapped the heavy brass locks of the briefcase shut. The loud metallic click echoed like a sharp gunshot in the tiny, miserable room. I turned my back on my weeping family and walked purposefully toward the peeling green door, fully prepared to leave them there to rot. "Starve, then," I said coldly, reaching for the rusted brass doorknob. "Wait!" Darren violently lunged forward across the dirty carpeted room. He slammed his shaking hand down flat on top of the printed legal script, his eyes wide with absolute final surrender. "We will do it." Darren kept his hand planted firmly on the printed legal script. His eyes were wide with total crushing defeat. "We will do it," Darren repeated, his voice completely devoid of any remaining pride. Just as the words left his mouth, the peeling green door of the dingy motel room slowly creaked open. Jamal stepped inside, violently shivering and soaking wet from the cold Atlanta rainstorm outside. He had not run far. He had only been hiding at a cheap dive bar across the busy highway until his stolen cash finally ran out, and the bartender aggressively kicked him out onto the street. He looked around the cramped, miserable room, his eyes widening in sheer panic when he saw me standing there in my pristine white designer suit. Darren did not hesitate for a single second. He marched heavily across the stained carpet, grabbed his golden son by the wet collar of his jacket, and violently shoved him toward the cheap laminate table. "You are going to fix the massive mess you created," Darren barked angrily. "Get your phone out right now." Jamal looked at his father in pure shock, then looked down at the legal contract resting next to my leather briefcase. He realized instantly that he had absolutely no way out of this situation. With trembling hands, Jamal pulled his cracked smartphone from his wet pocket. He propped it up against a stack of cheap plastic water cups on the table. He opened his social media application and navigated directly to the live broadcasting feature. I slowly walked backward, stepping entirely out of the camera's frame. I positioned myself in the dark corner of the small motel room, crossing my arms over my chest. I wanted a front row seat to their ultimate destruction, but I firmly refused to let my face be captured on their feed. This was their public execution, not mine. "Start the broadcast," I commanded from the shadows. Jamal tapped the screen. The small red live indicator flashed brightly in the corner of his phone. Because of his dramatic weeping performance 2 weeks ago, his account had recently gained thousands of followers who were hungry for more high society gossip. Within 60 seconds, the viewer count skyrocketed exponentially. 2,000, 5,000. 10,000 people tuned in eagerly, expecting another explosive, tear-filled rant against the evil billionaire sister who had supposedly ruined their innocent lives. Instead, they were greeted by the pathetic, horrifying sight of the once mighty Davis family crammed tightly into a filthy motel room, looking completely broken and utterly destitute. "Read the script," I whispered coldly. Vivian was the first to speak. She slowly picked up the legal document, her hands shaking so violently, the paper loudly rattled in the quiet room. She looked directly into the camera lens. The arrogant, pious matriarch of the elite church community was permanently gone. "My name is Vivian Davis," she began, her voice cracking heavily under the immense weight of her own public humiliation. "I am making this broadcast to retract every single statement previously made by my son on this platform. I am a toxic, deeply jealous, and manipulative mother. When my daughter Nia was 18 years old, I secretly went to the bank and stole her entire $80,000 college fund. I deliberately drained the money she earned from working double shifts, and I handed it all to Jamal. When she confronted me about the missing funds, I threw her out of my house and forced her to live in her freezing car. I lied to our church. I lied to our friends. I abandoned my own child out of pure spite and greed." The viewer count rapidly surged to 20,000. The comment section on the side of the screen began to scroll at lightning speed, but Vivian was legally forced to keep reading. Jamal stepped into the frame next, wiping rain and nervous sweat from his face. He looked at the camera, his tough street persona completely incinerated. "I am a total fraud," Jamal confessed, his voice shaking with intense shame. The luxury car rental business I started was funded entirely by money stolen from my little sister. I ran it into the ground because I am completely incompetent. I am currently drowning in massive illegal gambling debts. I conspired with Jasmine to forge our parents' signatures on a massive secondary mortgage to pay off violent loan sharks. I publicly blamed Nia for our problems because I am a coward who refuses to take responsibility for my own criminal actions. Jasmine was next. She had to be physically supported by Darren just to stand up in front of the recording phone. Her beautiful face was deeply swollen and blotchy from days of crying. She stared into the lens, knowing perfectly well that DeAndre, Mrs. Sterling, and the entire Atlanta high society elite were undoubtedly watching her live broadcast. My entire influencer lifestyle is a carefully constructed lie. Jasmine sobbed, the heavy tears flowing freely down her cheeks. I systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from DeAndre's corporate real estate accounts. I used his company payroll to buy fake followers' designer handbags and the deposits for a luxury wedding I could never afford. I desperately wanted to pretend I was old money, but that is not the worst thing I did. Jasmine took a ragged, agonizing breath. The motel room felt freezing cold as she prepared to read the darkest paragraph of the legally binding script. The night before my wedding, Jasmine read, her voice dropping to a terrified, guilty whisper. I approached a catering staff member at the Obsidian Resort. I offered them a large cash bribe to intentionally slip a severe food allergen into Nia's dinner plate. I knew she was highly allergic. I actively hoped to trigger a massive medical emergency to put my sister in the hospital so she would not be able to attend the wedding and expose my financial crimes. I am a thief, a liar, and I maliciously attempted to severely injure my own sister. Darren was the last to step in front of the camera. The proud father who had demanded unquestioning respect his entire life now looked directly at his community with a face full of absolute disgrace. I am Darren Davis. He said, his tone flat and incredibly hollow. I am a weak, pathetic coward. I watched my wife emotionally abuse and financially exploit our daughter for decades. I watched them steal her future, and I did absolutely nothing to stop it because I preferred to maintain a fake, comfortable peace in my household rather than step up and protect my own child. We do not deserve your prayers. We do not deserve your sympathy. We brought this total financial and social ruin entirely upon ourselves. Darren reached out with a trembling finger and hit the button to end the live broadcast. The phone's screen went completely black. The immediate aftermath of the broadcast was instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Jamal's phone began vibrating violently off the cheap laminate table. It was flooded with thousands of incoming text messages, missed calls, and furious social media notifications. The comments on the live stream had been absolutely brutal. Members of Vivian's elite prayer circle typed out long paragraphs of pure disgust, openly excommunicating her from their congregation in real time. Mrs. Sterling's wealthy friends left hundreds of vomiting emojis, absolutely appalled by Jasmine's attempted poisoning plot. Black Twitter had screen recorded the entire stream and was already dissecting the massive fall from grace, quickly turning the Davis family into the ultimate local cautionary tale of toxic parenting and unhinged greed. The fake, pristine, perfect image of the Davis family was permanently, irrevocably incinerated. There was nowhere left for them to hide in Atlanta. There was no church that would welcome them, no country club that would accept their applications, and no business that would ever hire them. They were officially the most hated people in the entire city. The tiny motel room descended into a heavy, suffocating silence. Nobody looked at each other. They simply stared at the stained carpet, entirely stripped of their massive egos, their false pride, and their carefully crafted societal masks. The absolute reality of their permanent isolation crashed down on their shoulders. I stepped out of the dark corner of the room, my white suit practically glowing in the dim, flickering overhead light. I walked back over to the cheap laminate table. My heels clicked loudly, confidently breaking the dead silence. I opened my designer leather briefcase and reached inside. I slid the $150,000 certified cashier's check across the table. It came to a stop right in front of Vivian. You performed exactly as instructed, I stated coldly, my voice showing absolutely zero emotion. The money is yours. Pay your legal restitution, get a tiny apartment, learn how to survive on minimum wage. Vivian looked down at the rectangular piece of paper. Her hands were shaking violently as she slowly reached out to grab the vital financial lifeline that would keep her out of the local homeless shelter. Her greedy fingers barely grazed the edge of the check before I reached back into my briefcase. I pulled out a second thick white envelope and firmly dropped it directly on top of the cashier's check, pinning it flat to the table. Vivian froze. She looked up at me, her eyes red and puffy, her voice completely hollow and defeated. "What is this?" Vivian asked softly. I stared down at the woman who had made my childhood a living nightmare. I looked at the arrogant brother who had stolen my future, the jealous sister who had tried to poison me, and the cowardly father who had watched it all happen without lifting a single finger. That I said, my voice echoing with absolute unyielding finality, is a permanent legally binding no-contact order. It strictly prohibits any of you from calling, texting, emailing, or approaching me within 500 feet for the rest of your natural lives. If you violate it even once, my security team will have you immediately arrested. I leaned in close, making sure Vivian looked directly into my cold, unforgiving eyes. "You sign it right now," I whispered ruthlessly, "or I cancel the check and you can figure out how to survive on the street." Vivian stared down at the heavy white envelope resting on the cheap, sticky laminate table. Her trembling hands hovered nervously over the thick legal document. The suffocating silence inside the dingy, dilapidated motel room was deafening. Darren was the very first person to finally move. He reached his shaking arm across the small table, aggressively grabbed a cheap plastic pen, and forcefully pulled the strict no-contact order directly toward his chest. He did not bother to read the legal paragraphs outlining his permanent banishment from my life. He simply flipped directly to the very last page and swiftly signed his name on the dotted line. He quickly slid the paper toward Vivian. She let out one final sob, slowly picked up the plastic pen, and permanently signed away her legal right to ever speak to me again. Jasmine and Jamal quietly followed suit, their toxic spirits broken. I gathered the signed documents, slipped them carefully into my briefcase, and snapped the brass locks shut. I did not offer them a final goodbye. I did not shed a tear for the family I was leaving behind. I simply turned on my high heel, walked straight out of the door, and stepped directly into the cool, refreshing Atlanta night. I slid into the back seat of my Maybach. As my loyal driver pulled away from the motel parking lot, I did not look back even once. A profound relief washed over my entire body and soul. The brutal aftermath of their public social execution was swift and absolutely merciless. Stripped completely of their stolen wealth and thoroughly disgraced in our local community, my biological family was violently forced to rapidly confront their horrifying new reality. The $150,000 cashier's check I provided barely kept them out of the overcrowded local homeless shelters. They reluctantly moved into a tiny, cramped, deeply undesirable two-bedroom apartment located in a rough, dangerous industrial neighborhood on the far forgotten outskirts of the city. Darren and Vivian were forcefully humbled, having to take exhausting minimum wage retail jobs just to afford their basic weekly groceries and utility bills. Jamal, constantly terrified of the violent loan sharks who were still aggressively hunting him down, worked the grueling graveyard shift at a local distribution warehouse, constantly looking nervously over his shoulder. Jasmine completely lost her highly coveted influencer status and her wealthy, prestigious fiancé in one single night. She was harshly reduced to bagging groceries at a discount supermarket, permanently stripped of her glamorous designer gowns and her expensive, flawless makeup. They still had their physical lives, but they had permanently lost absolutely everything they actually valued in this world. They completely lost their elite social status. They lost their toxic, overwhelming pride. Most importantly, they permanently lost their ability to ever control, manipulate, or hurt me again. They became total, untouchable pariahs in the city of Atlanta. Their former deeply loyal church friends purposely crossed the busy street just to avoid interacting with them. They were entirely invisible, treated exactly the way they had always treated me. 6 incredibly fast, highly productive months rapidly passed. The dark, heavy, suffocating clouds of my traumatic past were permanently replaced by the blinding, brilliant, beautiful light of my highly successful present reality. It was a crisp, clear Saturday evening, and I was standing confidently in the exact center of the grand, opulent ballroom at the Obsidian. The massive, breathtaking luxury venue was absolutely bustling tonight, full of vibrant life, powerful positive energy, and breathtaking, unmatched elegance. The massive imported crystal chandeliers glowed warmly above a massive, diverse crowd of highly influential, deeply respected Black entrepreneurs, talented artists, and prominent community leaders. But this magnificent gathering was not a toxic, fake high society wedding. I was proudly hosting the inaugural, highly anticipated Apex Holdings Charity Gala. The massive philanthropic event was specifically designed and fully funded to award substantial life-changing business grants to young, brilliant Black women who were desperately seeking reliable startup capital. I personally created the foundation to ensure that no one else would ever have their hard-earned dreams stolen the way mine almost were. I watched a young, brilliant software developer cry, beautiful tears of absolute joy, as she graciously accepted a $50,000 grant to officially launch her innovative educational technology platform. She hugged me tightly continuously, thanking me for fiercely believing in her unique vision. I smiled genuinely, feeling a profound, deep sense of authentic purpose that no amount of petty, vindictive revenge could ever truly provide to my soul. Xavier smoothly approached my side, looking impeccably sharp and incredibly handsome in a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo. He gently handed me a tall, elegant crystal flute filled to the brim with premium, highly expensive vintage champagne. We just got the final consolidated financial reports from the senior acquisitions team, Xavier said, a proud, brilliantly glowing smile completely illuminating his face. We officially closed the massive Southern expansion deal this afternoon. It is a record-breaking historical quarter for Apex Holdings NIA. We absolutely crushed the initial revenue projections. I carefully took the delicate champagne glass, the cool, smooth crystal firmly grounding me in this beautiful, undeniably triumphant moment. I proudly raised my glass high to meet his. To constantly crushing projections and breaking barriers, I replied smoothly. The two crystal glasses clinked together with a sharp, deeply satisfying melodic ring. I took a slow, luxurious sip of the expensive champagne and looked out over the massive, glittering, powerful corporate empire I had built entirely with my own two bare hands. I was no longer the frightened, freezing, abandoned teenager, desperately sleeping in the back seat of a rusted, broken-down sedan. I was safely surrounded by a fiercely loyal, deeply loving chosen family that actively respects me highly, values my intellect, and fiercely protects my absolute peace. The pathetic, forgotten family scapegoat had finally become the undisputed, powerful queen of Atlanta, and my magnificent throne was absolutely untouchable.